going from indie games, this is a really nice transition to a much more corporate game, which is Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Unity. So, when the French video game company Ubisoft announced that their latest installment of its successful Assassin's Creed series would not feature any playable female characters, there was a public outcry, mostly from American gamers, lamenting the stark gender disparity that exists amongst playable protagonists in role-playing games. While many video games are criticized for their lack of female avatars, the lack in Assassin's Creed Unity was particularly troubling. The game is a historical reimagining of the French Revolution, wherein the player is a male assassin, and of course, one of the most famous assassins of the French Revolution was female, Charlotte Corday. Born to a minor aristocratic family in Normandy, Corday ultimately played a major role in the French Revolution. When the revolution began to radicalize and head towards terror, Charlotte Corday began sympathizing largely with the Girondins, who campaigned to end the monarchy but wished to contain violence. Jean-Paul Marat, on the other hand, was a member of the radical Jacobin faction that had a leading role during the Reign of Terror. As a journalist, Marat exerted power and influence through his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the Friend of the People. Corday held Marat personally responsible for the horrific September massacres of 1792 through his vitriolic rhetoric in L'Ami du Peuple, and further feared an all-out civil war if he continued to encourage radicalism in the press. Initially, she planned to assassinate Marat in front of the entire National Convention, making an example out of him. But because of his health, which was deteriorating at the time, she was forced to change her plan. She went to Marat's home, claiming to have knowledge of a planned Girondist uprising, where she then stabbed him in his bathtub, piercing his lung, aorta, and left ventricle. Corday was promptly convicted and sent to the guillotine, but expressed no remorse for her crime, saying, quote, "I knew that he was perverting France. I've killed one man to save 100,000, end quote. Years later, writer Alphonse de Lamartine gave Corday the posthumous nickname L'Ange de l'Assassinat, the Angel of Assassination. Despite many historical figures of the revolution being present in Assassin's Creed Unity, Corday is never to be seen or even alluded to. The studio defended the exclusion of female playable characters as a technical constraint, stating that rendering them, even for multiplayer gameplay, would be too time and resource intensive. But the omission of figures, yes, it's ridiculous. You're allowed to laugh. But the omission of figures like Corday from the game, however fictionalized its account of the French Revolution may be, speaks to a larger historical omission of female agency in popular retellings of the French Revolution. Apart from the American polemic over female avatars, French critics have lambasted the game's hyper-simplistic portrayal of the revolutionary masses as bloodthirsty, Marie Antoinette as a poor little rich girl, who seemingly has more in common with Sofia Coppola's recent reimagining of her than the historical Marie Antoinette, and finally, Robespierre as a sick, sadistic villain. It should be noted, despite his infamy, Robespierre is also happened to be the leader of the movement that granted suffrage to Jews and unsuccessfully attempted to grant suffrage to women after the revolution. Assassin's Creed Unity is just one example of how popular retellings of the French Revolution ignore the role of women, and in this case, quite literally remove female agency in historical narratives. Moreover, it's yet another example of a lack of female agency in video games, and serves as an excellent pretext to the ongoing feminist discourse, both within and outside of the video game industry. The dual polemics over Assassin's Creed Unity coincide with Gamergate, a Twitter hashtag following the American cultural moment where one of the most prominent feminist video game critics, Anita Sarkeesian, and her research have been the target of horrific threats, including rape, shootings, and bombings. Her detractors claim that feminist critics are being overly sensitive to the role of women in the video game industry and ignore its long-time popularity amongst younger men, arguably its key demographic. But the market for video games is rapidly changing, somewhat as John has discussed, with women constituting larger and larger percentages of the gaming community. According to the Entertainment Software Association, 48% of gamers in the United States are now women, a figure that has grown as new opportunities to play games through mobile devices, social networks, and other avenues have proliferated. Game developers, however, continue to be mostly males. This goes to Koji's point. In a survey conducted earlier this year by the International Game Developers Association, a nonprofit association for game developers, that's clear, only 21% of respondents said they were female. And here I should say that I realize there are more than 2 gender identities, but I'm just going off of what these surveys gave me, so. Similarly, the field of video game criticism, already quite young as a discipline, is struggling to include feminist perspectives, both within academia and in popular culture. Sarkeesian's work, namely her crowdfunded project, Tropes versus Women, represents only a small fraction of the feminist criticism that currently exists, yet she has bared the brunt of death threats and trolling in the so-called Gamergate. Despite an abundance of video games lacking female playable characters, as well as a plethora of critical feminist voices in the debate, both Assassin's Creed Unity and Sarkeesian, respectively, have become the foci of the feminist video game discourse. To explain why, I refer first to the feminist historian Joan Wallach Scott's text, Only Paradoxes to Offer, detailing the exclusion of women in French politics from the Revolution to today. The paradox that Scott describes is not simply, quote, the oxymoronic description of women claiming the rights of man, end quote, but rather how the history of feminism is the history of women who have had, quote, only paradoxes to offer, not because, as misogynist critics would have it, women's reasoning capacities are deficient or their nature is fundamentally contrary, not because feminism somehow hasn't been able to get its theory and practice right, but because historically modern Western feminism is constituted by the discursive practices of democratic politics that have equated individuality with masculinity, unquote. Scott's conception of feminist discourse plays perfectly into both debates over Assassin's Creed Unity and Gamergate. The game's lack of female avatars perfectly mirrors the conflation of masculinity with individuality, or, as I argue, with universalism. When defending the choice to not include female avatars for the game's protagonist, its director, Alex Amancio, told the gaming news outlet Eurogamer, quote, I understand the issue of female playable characters. I understand the cause, and it's a noble one, but I don't think it's relevant in the case of Unity. In Unity, you play this character called Arnaud. And when you're playing co-op, you're also playing Arnaud. Everybody is. It's like Aiden Pierce in Watch Dogs, unquote. By invoking Aiden Pierce, the so-called everyman protagonist of the video game Watch Dogs, Amancio is expressing his goal for the game to allow its player to experience the French Revolution through the eyes, or rather body, of the common man. Here, Arnaud de rien. But according to Amancio, Arnaud is more than just an avatar. He goes on to explain, quote, Arnaud has different skills. You select skill points in the game, there are clear gear elements that have an impact, and all of these weapons that make the character your own. But you're always playing as Arnaud. Essentially, Arnaud is just a male foundation of a protagonist that the player customizes and builds upon in terms of skills and abilities as the game progresses. But nonetheless, this is a male avatar with which the player is forced to see and interact with the virtual world. The game itself, which Sarkeesian has never treated in her research, but has briefly commented on via social media. I'll just give you a second to read this, because I enjoy it so much. Is often of particular importance to both feminist and historical criticism, if only for its failure to retell the complex political and gendered narratives of the French Revolution to an audience that will most likely never receive an in-depth analysis of both histories. Since its first installment in 2007, the Assassin's Creed franchise has been wildly successful, both financially and critically. With 8 different main installments, the historical fiction video game series is available across 14 different game-playing platforms. As of 2014, the franchise has sold over 73 million copies and generated over $3.5 billion, making it by far one of the most popular and profitable series of Ubisoft. This latest installment, Unity, is no exception to the franchise's success, selling over 10 million copies in conjunction with the release of the secondary title, Rogue, before the end of 2014. It was released in November, I should say. Because of this success, Ubisoft has been able to greatly expand both its development and publishing teams, yet its primary excuse for not including any female character avatars in Unity was that of production resources, according to Amancio. This was then directly refuted by the animation developer of Assassin's Creed 3, Jonathan Cooper, who tweeted shortly thereafter, quote, in my educated opinion, I would estimate this to be a day or two's work, not a replacement of 8,000 animations, end quote. As a further criticism of the excuse of limited resources for the game's lack of female avatars, it's also worth noting that Unity is a sandbox game, where a player is able to explore nearly the entirety of revolutionary Paris, rendered in stunning detail. Here, I borrow from the work of Tumblr user Damien Hippolyte, who took photos around Paris to show the level of detail the game's developer paid faithfully in restoring revolutionary Paris. So, that's a nice part. Finally, last one, shopping up with them. You can't not have that. Okay. Necessary. Before even playing the game, it's important to look at its marketing. Take, for example, this promotional still of the protagonist Arnaud standing proudly on a pile of burning debris while the tricolore flag waves before Notre Dame in the background. Let's compare this to Eugène Delacroix's 1830 painting, Liberty Leading the People. Just in case the reference isn't totally obvious, we can also look at this promotional figurine of Arnaud sold with the collector's edition of the game, in which, just like Liberty, he too is waving the tricolore flag of the revolution while brandishing a bayonet in his other hand. Apart from the obvious anachronism of Delacroix's painting commemorating the July Revolution of 1830 and not the French Revolution of 1789, the still of Arnaud is clearly inspired by this personification of the goddess Liberty, also viewed as one of the earliest depictions of Marianne as a symbol of France in the French Republic. Delacroix depicts Liberty both as an allegorical goddess, but more importantly as a very real, robust woman of the people, proudly waving the revolutionary flag as a call to arms with a bayoneted musket in her other hand. Also with Notre Dame in the distance, which I'll show. So, that's it. I had fun with this PowerPoint. Whereas Arnaud the everyman's face is obscured by his hood to preserve his anonymity, Liberty's face is depicted clearly, showing off both her profile and her Phrygian cap, a longtime millenary symbol of the liberty of France. She stands tall above the revolutionary masses. The fighters that surround her are from a mixture of social classes, ranging from the bourgeoisie, represented by the young man in the top hat, a student from the prestigious École Polytechnique, wearing the traditional bicorn, to the revolutionary urban worker, as exemplified by the boy holding pistols, not to mention the women in the foreground. Let's now contrast this to our Assassin's Creed protagonist Arnaud, standing far away from the revolutionary masses, visibly all men of the same age and dress. Turning to the game itself, Arnaud Dorian is always a hooded figure during gameplay, with shadows obscuring his face. This anonymity, of course, relates to the gameplay as an assassin, but if anonymity is truly the intent of an assassin avatar, I don't see why the avatar's gender should be both so apparent and so fixed, especially considering that as a role-playing game, the player never needs to see the avatar's face during the gameplay, but instead will only see the back of their body. Which is why I come back to Scott's conception of democratic politics that have equated individuality with masculinity, and vice versa. Even in the 21st century, when reimagining history in popular media, there's an attempt to masculinize history to make it more universally appreciable. Arnaud is an anonymous, yet so vaguely male avatar onto which the player can project him or herself, filling in the shadows obscuring his face with their own. Arguably, Arnaud is not so much a male protagonist as he is a depiction of Marianne, or even Charlotte Corday, stripped of their female forms and qualities, only to be replaced and forgotten by both the player and by history. Thank you.